Hola a todos desde Italia, donde yo vivo. Me llamo Fiona Hunter, y soy la tercera profesora de este módulo sobre la internacionalización. Y como pueden oír, hablo algo de español, pero continuaré esta clase en inglés sobre las estrategias para la internacionalización. Pero ustedes pueden escribir sus trabajos en inglés o en español, no es un problema. Okay, so then let's carry on in English. This fifth, I think, session is on strategies for internationalization. And I have divided the session into 4 parts. And each part is a separate video, and you should look at all 4 videos. And at the end of each video, you will find the assignment that you're being asked to do. So there are 4 mini assignments that must be completed for this session. So session 1 is the one we're doing today, called A Change in Context. Session 2, Why Have a Strategic Plan? Session 3, I will look at one model in particular that I think is a good one. And we will wrap up in the 4th session looking at the success factors for internationalization strategies. So, let's kick off then with our first session on the changing context. I don't think there can be any doubt that you are all aware that universities today are working in a context that is both highly complex and rapidly changing. First of all, the concept of the global knowledge economy is one that has moved universities centre stage, since they are now expected to make a key contribution to that global knowledge economy in terms of employable graduates, transferable knowledge. The world economy is increasingly integrated, and the pace of change is being accelerated also by the huge advances that are being made in the information and communication technologies. And as we go through these different ideas of change, think actively as I talk about how this is playing out in your particular context, in your country, in your institution. Increasingly then, we're seeing internationalization as a key response to globalization. I'm sure you have heard a lot about that from Hans in the earlier sessions. But that, seeing it as a key response, also means that it is becoming a key strategic priority in many institutions, but also many countries, as we see more and more countries developing strategies for internationalization. In internationalization itself, we see a clear shift away from cooperation and exchange to a more competitive understanding of internationalization. That doesn't mean cooperation is disappearing, but it means that there is now this very evident mix of both cooperation and competition. And here you can see in the presentation some examples of that. The race for talent, international student recruitment, joint degree programs, branch campuses, many other global initiatives are driven often not only by academic rationales, but also for pressures for income generation and institutional positioning. There's also a vast increase in the scale and scope of international activities, an intensification of competition, with many new countries and institutions becoming increasingly active and challenging many of the established players. We have experienced in recent years a significant amount of economic and financial instability that can change very rapidly the flows of students and scholars between different countries. We have seen the global trends of massification, diversification, privatization that have altered the very nature of the higher education enterprise. and are having impacts on all sorts of issues: access, equality, and brain drain. And then I think this final point is a key one. It's one that we hardly mentioned even perhaps a year and a half ago, but increasingly we can see this recent wave of anti-globalization, anti-immigration, xenophobia and other forms of populism, which are very apparent here in Europe, but not only, and will impact internationalization developments around the world significantly in the years to come. And I think they also challenge the assumption up until now that internationalization is necessarily a good thing. I think it is increasing the so-called dark side of internationalization. And so all of this begs the question as, to whether we can talk about quality in higher education today without an international dimension. That's something I ask you to reflect on as you do this particular part of the module. It's hard to imagine any form of higher education that has no international dimension at all. But give it some thought and see how that takes shape in your mind. I like very much this quote from Jane Knight. She says, "Internationalization is changing the world of higher education, and globalization is changing the world of internationalization." I think that sums up really nicely some of those trends I identified at the beginning of this presentation. And it really emphasizes how internationalization is increasingly being identified as a strategic response to this increasingly global and competitive environment. It's not something universities would do naturally, I think, but they are being driven by external pressures to become more strategic about internationalization. I like very much this quote from Phil Altbach, who the ex-director at Boston College, in a presentation once that he was making at our centre in Milan. He said, "Risk of failure concentrates the mind in an international direction." And I think that also sums up very nicely where many institutions are today and their need to think more internationally and develop a more strategic approach to their international endeavours. Why? Because there are a number of consequences that can be identified now around not responding, not becoming more international and not being more strategic about that international approach. There is an evident danger of losing significance and relevance in education and particularly in research. A lack of international dimension will most likely impact the ability to attract students, attract possibly staff, perhaps less so in some world regions, but certainly an inability to attract funding, as increasingly funding is more international than national these days. In an internationalized higher education arena, competition becomes much more difficult, but also it has an impact on the ability to make a contribution at local or regional level if the university is not able to transfer knowledge around change and knowledge that is developing at an international level. Which means if the university is not working in big international research groups, that it won't be able to make a contribution to those big questions that are challenging the world today. And much of the funding in Europe certainly is linked to those big questions around climate, around health, and so on. And inevitably, by not changing, by not becoming more international, there is a risk of going into decline, and that is not a place universities want to be. That becomes a very difficult situation to manage. That said, universities are not always good at responding. Strategic planning is not a higher education tradition. It's something that has happened relatively recently in universities. And therefore, they're not structured in a way that enables them to develop strategic plans easily, not only to develop them, but also to deliver them. So, as I've already said, there's the general lack of experience in strategic thinking and planning. Traditionally, universities are more inward than outward facing. They do not necessarily gather information about their environment. They do not always pick up on evolving stakeholder needs fast enough. And certainly in many, there's not a tradition of leadership and management, of professionalised leadership, of management, of choosing leaders who have experience of managing institutions to sit at the top of the organisation and to make those strategic choices. And one of the reasons for that is that the type of university culture tends to be more collegial or bureaucratic rather than entrepreneurial. And that is a change that is happening in some universities, but certainly not in all. And as a consequence of all of this, the risk is that they may have academic portfolios that are out of line with expectations of students, of stakeholders, of different user groups. And that will inevitably lead to a decline in student enrolment, and the impact of that can lead to issues of financial vulnerability and sustainability. That can all sound very dramatic, but I think most institutions today that have not come to terms with a good strategic planning process will, if they're honest enough with themselves, identify some of those trends in their own institution. So, that may sound a little dramatic, a little pessimistic, but I wanted just to give you a very, very global overview of the trends in globalization, but also the trends in higher education responses. So I think on the whole, universities are not well equipped today to respond, but that doesn't mean they are not beginning to think about it and beginning to make those changes. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, there will be 4 sections to, excuse me, to this session, and in each one, excuse me, I'm just going to have a drink of water. And in each one, at the end, there will be a question or a couple of questions that I would like you to address and write up for the assignment. And this one, first one, I would like you to reflect in terms of the region. So by putting your different universities, different countries together, could you come up with an overview of the points raised here that you feel are most relevant in Latin America in terms of what are the trends? There may be other trends I didn't mention that you feel are more relevant. And also how you feel the institutions are responding. Do you see higher education institutions in Latin America as being strategic in their approach to internationalization? Or do you feel there is, shall we say, room for improvement? So I leave you with these questions, and I look forward very much to seeing how you respond. I hope everything was clear for you and that you can understand my English okay. I forgot to say at the beginning that I come from Scotland, but I hope nevertheless this accent is not too difficult for you. And I shall see you shortly in the next video. Thank you, and good luck with your questions.